I'm recording this video in March of 2022 as the Russian invasion of Ukraine plays out and Russian bombs and artillery shells rain down on Ukrainian cities. Last year in 2021, British Journal of Politics and International Relations published the online first version of my article entitled "The West, Russia and European Security, Still the Long Peace." With war raging in Ukraine, it may seem contradictory, even perverse, to talk about peace between Russia and the West. In this video, I'll explain the logic of my argument and why I think it's still largely correct. My argument borrows from the US historian John Lewis Gaddis. Gaddis famously described the Cold War as the long peace. Gaddis argued that, the Cold War involved an intense militarized confrontation between East and West and periodic crises. One of the most striking features of that conflict was that it never escalated to a direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union, a Third World War. My argument is that despite growing tensions between Russia and the West, a number of factors make escalation to a large-scale war between Russia and the West unlikely. These factors can be summarized as follows. First, the European balance of power, which I describe as modified bipolarity. This pits Russia against the combined political, economic and military power of the West, including NATO and the European Union. As this balance of power overwhelmingly favours the West, this creates a powerful deterrence against Russia being drawn into any prolonged conflict with the West. Second, the possession of nuclear weapons by the United States and Russia, as well as France and the United Kingdom, creates the risk of any major East-West war being unprecedentedly destructive. Again, this creates a powerful deterrence against initiating or being drawn into any conflict which might escalate to nuclear war. Third, since 1945, and in contrast with the situation which existed in 1914 or 1939, the major powers have developed practices of crisis management and crisis communication which have helped to avoid crises and regional wars escalating into great power wars. Additionally, in line with many other thinkers, I argued in my article that economic interdependence, in particular European dependence on Russian gas and oil supplies, was a pacifying force in terms of Russo-Western conflict. In light of developments since the start of the Ukraine conflict, this particular argument probably is less credible. We can see the kinds of dynamics which I describe being played out in the Ukraine conflict. The West is reluctant to intervene in Ukraine exactly because doing so would risk direct escalation to a war between NATO and Russia. This has been particularly clear in relation to the issue of a possible no-fly zone. US President Joe Biden and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg have been clear that they reject a no-fly zone over Ukraine because they don't want to be drawn into an air war with Russia. Second, if we look at Russia's behaviour, despite the massive scale of Russia's military intervention in Ukraine and Russia's willingness to indiscriminately target Ukrainian cities, Russia, at least so far, has been cautious to avoid military actions that might spill over into NATO states. Also, relatively quietly, the US military has established communication hotlines with the Russian military to avoid unintended escalation, especially in airspace and seas. The situation, of course, is very worrying, and there is a risk of escalation to a wider war between Russia and the West. A number of scenarios are conceivable. An unintended incident, especially between aircraft operating in close proximity, could trigger escalation. If Russia faces prolonged resistance from Ukraine, it could target weapons supply routes in NATO countries. If the war goes badly for Russia, President Putin could decide to escalate by attacking NATO territory or even by using nuclear weapons. This risk may be especially high if the Russian regime or President Putin believe their survival is under direct threat. Additionally, if the scale of Russian atrocities in Ukraine escalates, Western leaders could face growing pressure to intervene in Ukraine. For all these reasons, wise and careful Western leadership is needed, and continued communication with Russia remains vital. All of this will be of no consolation to the people of Ukraine. Indeed, one of the reasons why Russia has invaded Ukraine is exactly because the Russian leadership calculates that the West will not go to war with Russia for a country that is not a NATO member. For all the appalling things that we see unfolding in Ukraine, my argument is that the conflict is more likely to be contained to Ukraine than to escalate to a Europe-wide war between Russia and the West. Time will tell if this analysis is correct.